Our next plenary keynote talk is by Manzhu Yu of Penn State University. And she will be talking about spatial temporal methodologies for the analysis and prediction of extreme weather events. So like we're switching big time skills.
Hi. Hello, everyone. Thank you for introducing me. And I want to use the time today to talk about our effort of developing spatial temporal methods for analyzing and predicting extreme weather events. This is very broad, but I wanted to focus on some of the examples that we did. And our focus, since I am a faculty member at the Department of Geography at Penn State, we usually focus on the human dimension and the intersection of human dimension and atmospheric and land and ocean, but my focus is really on the weather extremes. So some of the bizarre extreme weather that we saw for the past few years, the Hawaiian wildfire, which has burned so many communities, the Libyan dam failure caused a flood, extreme flood, Canadian wildfire transporting long distance to half of the United States, including Pennsylvania, and then dust storms like Haboob's, extreme dust storms sweeping across Phoenix and other places, arid. So we're facing in a lot of those cases are actually compound, cascading, and human influence. So the question is no longer how physical model is capable to predict or simulate. The question now becomes how we can actually see the coupled system, physical, ecological, and human system being together. So as that, I think that the interactions are dynamic. The interactions are human influenced and the interactions can be highly localized. So my approach today, and also in the examples that we're doing right now, are using spatial temporal modeling, which incorporating spatial dimension and temporal dimension at the same time, using the way of the traditional machine learning or deep learning methods. And we also incorporate human environment feedback together. The goal here is really to better understand, and predict and communicate such events with human beings. So my expertise is remote sensing. So I have a background in remote sensing. And right now I'm focusing on applying remote sensing data products in geoinformation science. That's the GI science. You probably don't hear about that very often. But the goal is to have a decomposed to 3 steps. The first step is to quantify the dynamics of extreme weather events. The second one is to identify if there are some relationship or fixed or dynamic relationship between these events with other physical and social factors. The third one is how we can better predict it, how we can communicate it with human beings. So spatial temporal methodologies would be the key today. And I want to use some examples that translate these models to people. A few years back, we did a review paper trying to understand how people are addressing the complexities of Earth system modeling using deep learning or machine learning methods in space and time. And some commonalities in terms of the complexities that we found are heterogeneous data set, are how models are handling spatial temporal dependence, how models are handling nonlinear and dynamic process. Remember that we're talking about machine learning and deep learning methods right now. How we are delineating the problems into boundaries and how the chosen scale is affecting the statistical results significantly. Whether models are generalizable to different places and across time scales, and whether models are explainable. And how are we using limited sample size, especially when the case of extreme weather is really not happening that much. So my focus is on models and deep learning or machine learning models, whether they are handling spatial and temporal dependence very well. So cases that we saw are for the models to incorporating some existing known spatial temporal autocorrelation as features into the model, and whether models are using a spatial temporally constrained way, so having modules inside the model that is handling both space and time, addressing the heterogeneity of data set in space and time, and also whether models are handling coherence in space and time, like the systematic patterns in space and time. Here is a snapshot of that review paper, so some of the things that people have done, and these are the suite of widely used methods in deep learning. and that starts from three-dimensional convolutional neural network that has spatial and temporal. So that's a three-dimensional data set, to a convolutional LSTM. So with convolution layers that is handling to learn the spatial patterns, long short-term memory, which is the LSTM handling the temporal aspect of the pattern. So that is usually used as a video sequence prediction type of model, to something that we see attention-based mechanism. So the attention-based mechanism are usually having the model more attended to most relevant features or most relevant spatial temporal scales. So those are the cases that we've seen in that paper, in the literature review. Many of these have unique ways of incorporating space and time, but they also face the challenges in dots, the challenges of heterogeneous data, especially the challenges of spatial temporal dependency. Much progress has focused on using existing architecture, but having some novel integration of modifications, having explainability incorporated, having uncertainty incorporated, and most recently we've seen physics-informed, physics-guided machine learning, and in this conference you'll also see one of my colleagues, their differentiable modeling approach. So every single one has this way of handling irregular data across scale and across context. I'm going to focus on something that we've done in three different types. The first type is to model the dynamics in space and time. And in this case, I have spatial temporal modules inside a deep learning model that handles some of these irregular data or handles some of these attention mechanisms. The first example is to predict PM 2.5 concentration during wildfire smoke events. So the base fundamental model here is called a transformer. Transformer was developed as a way to generate language or to translate language. Further on, it was used to do a time series prediction. So we're using the transformer in the time series prediction type. And then we added something called a sparse attention, which is in orange here. Sparse attention coupled with some spatial embedding, temporal embedding, and value embedding here actually help us to learn a better way of what are the most relevant spatial and temporal features to be used to predict PM 2.5, especially during wildfire smoke. There will be abrupt changes of PM 2.5 concentration at the ground level. So being able to use the spatial temporal features wisely, like where are the fire, where is the wind, what is the wind pattern, what are the meteorological covariates, can actually help us resulting in a better prediction of pollutant spikes. The second example is what we did for a wildfire progression. So wildfire, how do they spread across the days? And the baseline model that we use here is something that I've introduced, convolutional LSTM. So it is the convolutional layer focusing on the spatial pattern, long short-term memory focused on the temporal pattern. Together, they have this video sequence prediction type of capability. It was originally developed to predict precipitation nowcasting. And now we're using that in the case of wildfire progression, still as a case of video sequencing prediction. So one of the things that we tried here in this spatial temporal module is to add something called attention. There are two attention that we tried over here. One is called pairwise and the other called is patchwise. Pairwise attention is like, you can think of this, I want to have a spatial temporal dependence to be modeled between every single pair of location in my spatial extent. Now you can have small distance spatial temporal dependence or a longer distance spatial temporal dependence. Think about wildfire spread where ember can transport longer distance than the fire line. So in this case, this pairwise attention is actually to address that. Patchwise attention is the opposite. We tried that as the opposite way, which is really the neighborhood effect. You're just using the neighbors to infer what is the central targeting cell. So in this case, you're seeing the four different cases of wildfire in California that we're using VIIRS satellite observation to see the progression. The colors are really from day one to the maximum day. So day one would be yellow, the maximum day would be red. So now you're seeing that pairwise attention, patchwise attention are the right-hand side two columns. We're seeing that the attention mechanism here is really helping to better track fire lines, so the fire front lines, especially when wind and slope are driving some of the uneven spread. And we're also seeing that in the mechanism of attention, it is showing us why and where some of the fire front lines are actually intensifying. The third example is a lightning onset example. So this is again using conval STM as the baseline, and remember that precipitation nowcasting as the original development of conval STM. In this case, we're just adding a generative adversarial network as the discriminator. So it means that we want to use conval STM to predict the spatial temporal patterns of the precipitative cloud. And then we want to use the generative network to reduce some of the false alarms, false positives. So this is actually increasing some of the spatial precision and the timing of lightning onset, which is crucial for early warning and storm prediction. Examples here are actually incorporating spatial and temporal explicitly as modules inside a deep learning model. So some of the cases that we're trying right now is to predict a flood spread or a flood extent. So that is ongoing work. Much of these work are actually funded by the NSF IUCRC Spatial Temporal Center. The second component, I have only 3 components. So the second component is how we can actually fill the gap of environmental observation. So observation that we're talking about in this slide right now is the ground observations of environmental pollutants, so air pollutants, and then the satellite observations that we're seeing from the atmospheric composition. So the first example is how we can actually predict on a spatial dimension. A spatial dimension meaning that can we have a map concentration of that. Usually in the case that we have ground observations station-based, so in this case, you're seeing the nitrogen dioxide from EPA's air quality system, locations are sparse. And then if you have a satellite observation, you can actually map them with the covariates of meteorological variables, geographical variables, to have a direct mapping of a 5-kilometer tropospheric nitrogen dioxide, which is ideal for area without dense monitoring on the ground. The second example is a temporal dimension. Remember, we're doing spatial temporal predictions. In this case, it's a temporal dimension prediction, which is again using long short-term memory to capture the temporal trend. And in this case, we're using a IoT data set collected, IoT sensors data collected on fleets. So that's why you're seeing only the corridors, the urban corridors on the roads. And we have a 150-meter resolution on that road gridded. So the long short-term memory here is really as a tool to capture the microclimate patterns on the street level sensors, and then to generate some of the next day hour air temperature forecast on a neighborhood level. This case would be a combination. So now we have a satellite observation for PM2.5, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and sulfur dioxide, and then we have the ground observation from EPA air quality systems. So the key right now is this is actually funded by Health Effect Institutes, and the goal of the project is to understand how unconventional oil and gas development is contributing to the overall emission inside Marcellus-Utica region, so Pennsylvania, Ohio, West Virginia, New Jersey, New York. And this part of the work is actually to see whether we can have a daily estimate of ground level pollutants for the 20 years inside that region. So data would be a key here. Now, when we have satellite observation using other covariates like emission, land use, environmental covariates, DEM, others, we can actually use a residual network to map the concentration on the ground. But then we have the ground truth only at the location where we are measuring it, only at the monitoring station. Then the question becomes how we can monitor, how we can modify the loss function so that the model is actually learning not just only at the available sensor location. So we have something called a spatial consistency loss, which is encouraging the neighboring cells to have similar pollutant predicted value when features are similar. The other thing that we have is a structured similarity loss, which is to make sure that the predicted map concentration is having or capturing some of the meteorological flow of wind and the boundary layer height and the observed from the satellite observation when there is data. The other thing that we have is, of course, the mean squared error at only the ground locations. So to have the model, to make the model generalizable to the 20-year and to the large region, we have a pre-trained model over the entire data set and have a refined process for every single day. This is actually making the model more spatially and temporally coherent and robust to missing data. So these examples are helping us to learn where we cannot directly measure or directly monitor. Now we're fusing some of the data set from we're fusing partial data set from multiple sources, and then we can generate a high resolution spatial and temporally in the environmental information that is supporting some of the health impact studies further on. The third component is connecting to the human layer. So the reason why we wanted to do that is really related to wildfire smoke, the wildfire smoke study that we did. The usual way of doing that is to use static population to see like population weighted exposure. Where are the places that we need to put priority on? Now, static population cannot capture who is exposed, where they are exposed, especially for events like wildfire smoke that is changing very quickly, and also natural hazards that are changing very quickly. So now we're integrating dynamic mobility data to learn, to reconstruct the actual population presence at an hourly scale, allowing us to rethink about exposure modeling. So the data set is really from a company called Admin. They actually produce neighborhood pattern data sets derived from anonymized mobile check-in data set. So we have mobile checking for every census block group. It is at a census block group level. And then you can have an hourly update of that. To estimate an hourly population at every census block group, you can use the population from census for that census block group, adding the inbound and subtracting the outbound. So that's the basic way to do that. And now what you're seeing as the time series, the first one on the top is actually State College, where Penn State University Park is from. You can see clearly the spring break, the spring semester, spring break, summer break, fall semester, and Thanksgiving break. The lower one is a visitor town, the visitor on the Holden Beach town, North Carolina. So now you can see the clear peak in summer, and then you can see the long weekends. So all of these are actually from a hourly population. To test this, we're actually using the Canadian wildfire smoke example. So in this case, we're testing on the Northeast United States, and we coupled the WolfCam modeling simulation output with a PM2.5 measure on the ground, and then we're generating an hourly estimate of the ground PM2.5. For the mobility data set, we concluded that human mobility actually decreases for the days when PM2.5 exceeds the hazardous level. But then comparing population-weighted exposure and mobility-based exposure, we're seeing that mobility-based exposure remain very high despite reduced mobility. This is probably because the significant exposure are still with limited movements. So this example gives us actual exposure for people where people actually go, except for where people live. So that is also applicable to other disaster response tools or policy guiding tools. Those are just some of the examples that we tried out. I want to wrestle with the questions further on and wrestle with you for the questions further on, like how much can we trust AI models? Can we actually predict what for the events that we've never seen? What if we do not act on AI predicted results, and how we can actually lift the human impacts in the Earth system models? With that, I'd like to thank you for the place for us to discuss about the future of modeling in a world shaped by extremes.
Thank you for a very interesting talk, Manzhu. I'm allowing for one question, even if we're like at the brink of time.
Great. Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. So I have a question regarding the predictability of AI models, as you actually mentioned in your final set of questions. How do you actually check the model ability to comply with the physical laws. For example, water balance, things like that. Thank you.
So some of the things, that's a great question. That's something that we're trying to do right now. Physics-informed machine learning is some of the trials that we do to have physical laws as a consistent in the loss function. That's the first way. The second way that we're trying is to have physical model as part of the machine learning model, but that's not there yet.